The first sign that something was wrong with our neighborhood wasn't the new rules about lawn height or mailbox color. It was the silence at dinner tables, the kind of silence that comes when bills stack higher than food portions, when parents glance at each other across cheap pasta and watered down juice, trying to smile for their children, but knowing the math doesn't add up anymore. And all of it, every last ounce of pressure, traced back to the woman who sat in her two-story brick mansion at the end of Willow Creek Drive like a queen perched. On her throne, HOA President Corinne Whitfield, a woman whose blonde bob and pearl necklaces disguised the predator that lived underneath. The kind who believed rules were weapons and power was oxygen, and she had both in abundance. So when she announced during that spring's HO meeting that in order to maintain the value and prestige of Willow Creek, monthly fees would be raised by 30% effective immediately. The collective gasp of homeowners wasn't just shock, it was fear. Because everyone already knew Corinne had been increasing fees little by little for years. But this jump wasn't little. It was devastating. It meant families that were already behind on medical bills or student loans or groceries would now be staring foreclosure in the eye. Yet no one dared to stand up in that moment because Curran had a way of turning dissent into punishment, fines for invisible infractions, threats of liens, letters from lawyers that she somehow always had on speed dial. And so the room full of fathers, mothers, retirees, and young couples just sat frozen while she tapped her pen against the podium like a gavel, smiling in that smug way that said she enjoyed the sound of control more than anything else in the world. And though I sat there too, hands clenched and fists on my knees, I knew then that something was going to break. Maybe not tonight, maybe not next week. But the weight of her greed pressed so hard on this community that something or someone would eventually snap, and as the weeks rolled by, you could see it happening in quiet ways. The little boy next door, whose lunchbox grew lighter each day. The retired veteran across the street who sold his antique tools one by one at the flea market. The mother of three who cried in her car at night because she couldn't afford both formula and the HO Corinne demanded. And through it all, Corinne strutted like a peacock at community events, boasting about how much higher our property values were compared to lesser neighborhoods nearby, never acknowledging that the only thing rising faster than property values was the number of families sliding toward bankruptcy. And still, she had the nerve to hand out violation notices for trivial things like improper curtain color or trash cans left out an extra hour, each carrying fines that stacked mercilessly, turning $100 mistakes into $1,000 debts. And in hushed whispers behind closed doors, neighbors began trading stories of what they'd lost. To her tyranny, one man's car repossessed after he chose to pay HOA fees instead of his auto loan. One woman's electricity shut off because she fell behind after a Corinne-issued fine doubled overnight. And yet, no one dared confront her outright because Corinne was untouchable, or at least she appeared to be with her lawyer husband always in the background, and her uncanny ability to discover dirt on anyone who crossed her. But as the summer heat rose and families wilted under financial pressure, a dangerous energy began to simmer, and I could feel it in every glance exchanged, at mailbox clusters, in every muttered curse when a new fee notice landed in someone's hand, in every tear shed quietly where Corinne couldn't see. Because people can only be pushed so far before desperation turns into defiance, and Corinne, blinded by her hunger for control, didn't see that storm coming, not even as she signed off on her most outrageous decision yet. An additional community beautification fee that was supposed to fund landscaping upgrades around her own mansion, billed evenly to every homeowner regardless of income, meaning the poorest families were now directly paying for the roses in Karen's front yard. And if silence had been the first sign, then what came next was the second, because that night, in kitchens and living rooms and garages across Willow Creek, people started whispering about fighting back, not with guns or fists, but with something more powerful, the truth, and though we didn't know it yet, the truth about Corinne's finances was uglier, darker, and far more explosive than any of us could have imagined. And Though none of us yet dared to openly challenge her, the whispers grew into plans. And the plans into something sharper, but before that spark of rebellion could ignite, the suffering had to reach its breaking point, and it did on a sweltering July afternoon when the Johnson family, who lived 2 houses down from me, had their home seized by the county sheriff. Not because they had defaulted on their mortgage, they had been on track, scraping by paycheck to paycheck, but because Karen had piled on fines so mercilessly that the HOA lien overtook their ability to pay. And when the sheriff nailed the foreclosure notice to their door, their youngest child stood on the porch clutching a half-empty juice box, watching his mother sob into her husband's arms, and that image spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, burning into every conscience, every quiet soul too afraid to stand up, and suddenly the cost of silence became too high. Yet Karen, in her arrogance, treated it like a victory, as though she had proven that her rules were absolute. And at the next HO meeting, she even bragged about how the Johnson property will serve as a reminder that we maintain standards here. Smiling that cruel little smile as if she hadn't just torn a family apart. And I remember staring at her across that room, the air thick with the stench of fear and anger, and realizing that this wasn't just about fees anymore. It was about survival, because if she could destroy the Johnsons, she could destroy anyone. And slowly, the reality dawned on us that our lives, our homes, our dignity were all held hostage by a woman who seemed to delight in tightening the screws of financial pressure until people broke. But what Karen didn't realize was that pressure, when applied long enough, doesn't just crush, it reshapes. It hardens, it forges something stronger, and though our community looked weak, behind closed doors something unbreakable was forming, a unity born from shared misery. And Karen's downfall, though still hidden in the shadows, had already begun. Because the truth, the one thing she couldn't find silence or control, was inching closer to the light, waiting for the moment to explode. And it would all start with a single mistake she made, a crack in her polished facade that none of us saw at first, but once revealed would unravel everything she had built. And that mistake, though at first invisible, began to take shape in the smallest of rumors, whispered at mailbox clusters where neighbors pretended to shuffle envelopes while their voices dipped low, or in hushed conversations over fences where the clang of watering cans disguised the words. And at first it sounded like nothing more than gossip, that maybe Karen's expensive handbags weren't gifts from her husband, that perhaps the luxury SUV she drove wasn't really paid in full, that the constant upgrades to her home, the imported tiles in her backyard patio and the gleaming marble countertops glimpsed through her kitchen window, weren't quite matching up with the Whitfields' declared income, and though most dismissed it as idle chatter from people desperate for a lifeline, the seed had been planted, and once a seed like that finds fertile soil in a desperate community, it doesn't stop growing, it spreads, twisting and tangling its way through every corner of conversation, until suspicion itself becomes a kind of power. But Karen, blinded by the glow of her own arrogance, didn't notice how eyes lingered longer on her manicured nails, how whispers swelled whenever she swished by in her designer heels. She was too busy tightening the noose, announcing yet another fee hike in August, this time an emergency reserve contribution to cover unexpected community expenses, though she never specified what those expenses were, and we all knew deep down that our money wasn't going to sidewalks or lighting or playground repairs. It was going straight into the black hole of Karen's ambition. And as wallets thinned and stomachs clenched, as fathers skipped meals so their kids could eat, and mothers begged creditors for another month of mercy, something broke in us, something raw and primal, and the silence that had once been our prison started turning into a weapon. Because silence can suffocate, but it can also sharpen into resolve. And soon the first act of defiance slipped through the cracks. A neighbor, anonymous, slid a manila envelope under my door late one night. And inside were copies of documents, financial statements, HOA ledgers, even a bank slip with Karen's signature. And I remember holding those papers under the weak glow of my kitchen lamp, heart pounding because what I saw didn't just confirm the rumors. It screamed corruption, mismanagement, theft, numbers that didn't add up, thousands of dollars missing, money funneled through accounts that didn't belong to the HOA. And though I didn't know who had delivered it, I knew instantly that this was the first weapon we had against her. A weapon more powerful than fists or shouts. The truth on paper, undeniable and damning, but even with that evidence in hand, fear still gripped me, because Karen was ruthless. And if she ever discovered I had this, she'd destroy me like she destroyed the Johnsons. Yet, as I sat there staring at the damning numbers, I thought of the hollow-eyed children in the neighborhood, of the couples on the verge of losing everything, of the quiet despair that had swallowed us all. And I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. That perhaps my role wasn't just as a neighbor suffering under Curran's reign, but as the one who would tear it down from the inside. And so, with trembling hands but a fire igniting in my chest, I began to plan, and I didn't yet know that. Exposing Curran's finances would unravel far more than her presidency. It would uncover secrets so tangled and dangerous that our entire neighborhood would never be the same again. Because Curran's greed wasn't just greed, it was desperation. And desperation leaves a trail of rot wherever it hides, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And once that fire had been lit inside me, there was no going back. Because every glance at a foreclosure sign, every child's face pressed against a darkened window after the power had been shut off, every weary sigh from a parent juggling 2 jobs and still failing to stay ahead of Karen's endless invoices, only poured gasoline onto it, and yet I had to be careful, for Karen's reach was long and her eyes sharp. She had spies in the neighborhood, sycophants who benefited from her reign, the ones who lived in fear but also believed in proximity to power, the kind of people who'd snitch on their own neighbors just to earn a smile from her. So I played my part in public, nodding dutifully at meetings, keeping my lawn trimmed to regulation length, waving politely when she passed by in her gleaming SUV. But behind closed doors, I worked like a thief in the night, poring over the documents again and again, matching dates and figures, cross-referencing the HOA bylaws with the bank statements, and the more I studied, the more the stench of fraud filled my house. Numbers shifted like sand beneath my fingers. Reserve funds that should have been untouchable had been siphoned off, vendor contracts inflated beyond reason, landscaping invoices billed twice, and always the same faint trail leading back to accounts tied to Karen or her husband. Yet the genius of it, if you could call it that, was how ordinary it all looked at first glance, because who questions an HOA president balancing a budget? Who questions a line item called community improvement? But when you stack years of them together, the rot is undeniable, and as I pieced the puzzle together, the neighborhood outside my window grew darker, not just from the shortening days of autumn, but from the weight of despair, because families were cracking, divorces whispered about, teenagers running away because their parents couldn't hold the house together, elderly couples selling everything just to keep a roof over their heads. And through it all, Karen kept strutting, pearls gleaming, smile sharp, as though she were feeding off our misery. And maybe she was. Maybe the power was an addiction, because every time someone bent the knee, she seemed to stand taller. But what she didn't know was that beneath her polished shoes, the ground was starting to shake, because word of those documents had spread quietly, carefully, like a secret resistance movement, and one by one, my neighbors started slipping notes into my mailbox, each with their own fragments of evidence photographs, of Karen meeting with contractors in shady backlots, receipts that didn't match services, even testimonies written shakily by retirees who had nothing left to lose. And slowly, painfully, the silence that had suffocated us began to knit us together, forging us into something Karen could never have imagined, a collective will, fragile yet dangerous. And with every new piece of evidence, with every whispered confession shared under the cover of night, we grew closer to the edge, and I knew that soon, very soon, we would have to confront her. But section one of this story, the part you need to understand before the explosion, wasn't about the confrontation itself. It was about how financial pressure twisted into a weapon, how greed metastasized into tyranny, how Karen, in her hunger for control, raised the stakes so high that people were starving, literally starving, because she wanted marble floors and imported wine. And she believed we were too weak, too divided, too scared to stop her. But she was wrong because though fear had kept U.S. shackled, desperation had melted those chains. And in that void where hopelessness once lived, a new strength was born, the kind that doesn't whisper anymore but roars. And as I sat by my kitchen window one cold October night, papers spread before me. The faint sounds of a hungry baby crying from the house across the street drifting into my ears. I realized something bone deep and certain. Karen had written her own doom, line by fraudulent line, fee by fee. Because you cannot bleed people dry without leaving traces of your own blood on the knife. And when we finally turned that blade around, it would cut her deeper than she ever imagined. And though she still thought herself untouchable, still thought the HOA was her kingdom, she had no idea that the walls were already closing in. That the truth about her finances was more toxic than any fine she had ever levied. And when it spilled into the light, it would destroy her not just in this neighborhood, but in ways that would echo far beyond Willow Creek. Because secrets like hers don't just ruin reputations, they ruin lives, and the first life to crumble would be hers. But when the moment to finally strike came, it didn't arrive with a bang or a shout. It came quietly, almost invisibly. The way storms always begin as whispers before they break into thunder. And it began on a gray November morning when a small group of us gathered in the basement of the old community center. The one Karen rarely bothered with because it lacked the glamour she adored, and we sat in a rough circle of folding chairs. Our faces pale in the dim light, each of us carrying something heavier than the manila envelopes and folders in our hands. We carried exhaustion, fear, rage, and above all, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the evidence we had collected would be enough to topple her empire, though none of us dared to say it aloud, not yet, because Karen's shadow still loomed over everything we did. And even there, hidden beneath layers of concrete and secrecy, we kept our voices low, as if the walls themselves might betray us. And the first to speak was Daniel Ruiz, the retired firefighter whose pension had been bled dry by fines until he nearly lost his house. His voice gravelly but steady as he said, "We can't wait anymore. We have enough here to bury her." And he slammed a stack of printouts onto the folding table, showing page after page of Karen's fraudulent spending, numbers highlighted in furious yellow ink. And as we all leaned forward, something electric surged through the room. A sense that we were no longer victims, but warriors arming ourselves for battle. Yet I knew better than to think it would be simple. Because Karen wasn't just greedy, she was cunning. She had the kind of ruthless intelligence that allowed her to see threats long before they arrived. And if we moved too quickly, she would crush us before we had a chance to breathe. So I said carefully, "We need a plan, not just evidence. Something that forces her hand in public. Something she can't wriggle out of with lawyers and intimidation." And as the others nodded, I could see the fear melting from their eyes, replaced by something harder, sharper, a collective hunger for justice. And it was then that we began to weave the plan that would change everything. A plan that involved timing, secrecy, and most of all, patience. Because we weren't just going to confront Karen, we were going to expose her so thoroughly that not even her money, her husband, or her lies could save her. But while we plotted in shadows, Karen grew bolder in the light, holding another HOA meeting where she announced yet another round of fee hikes, her voice dripping with condescension as she told us it was for the good of the community. And I watched the faces around me, watched the way jaws clenched and fists tightened. And for the first time, I realized people weren't afraid of her anymore. Not the way they had been, because once hope creeps back into the hearts of the oppressed, fear starts to erupt. And Karen didn't see it. She only saw compliance. She only saw bowed heads, not realizing that underneath the ground had shifted. And when she smirked and added a $200 holiday decoration fee that would fund the lights on our own mansion, the silence in the room wasn't submission, it was the calm before the storm. And as I sat there, the evidence burning a hole in my bag, I felt the weight of inevitability press down on me. Because there was no turning back now, not for me, not for any of us. The fight was already written in the air. And soon the truth about Karen's finances would be dragged into the light, no matter how many claws she sank into us trying to stop it. And the first real crack in her armor appeared just a week later, though she didn't recognize it as such because tyrants never do, not until it's too late. And it came in the form of a simple question during the December HOA meeting when Margaret Ellis, a quiet widow who rarely spoke, lifted her trembling hand and asked, "Karen, can you please show us the receipts for these fees? We've been paying so much more, and I don't understand where it all goes." And for a heartbeat, the entire room froze, as if everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Because no one had ever dared to question Karen so directly. Before, not in front of everyone. And Karen's eyes, those sharp, hawk-like eyes that had cowed stronger men into silence, flicked toward Margaret with a glint of disdain, her smile tightening as she said smoothly, "All financial matters are handled by the board and are not subject to homeowner scrutiny beyond the annual report," which, as you all know, reflects our commitment to transparency. But the thing was, none of us had ever actually seen an honest report. Only vague numbers that meant nothing, and for the first time people began to murmur, heads turning, suspicion, stirring like a breeze through dry leaves, and though Karen quickly moved on, her gavel cracking the table like a gunshot, I saw it, the tiniest quiver in her hand, the faintest flush on her cheeks, and I knew then that she was rattled. That Margaret's simple question had struck deeper than any shouting match ever could, and that was when I realized our plan was working. Not because we had revealed the evidence yet, but because Corinne had shown weakness, and predators who show. Weakness are already halfway defeated, though they never realize it until the end. And from that moment, the resistance in our neighborhood grew teeth. People who had been too scared to look me in the eye were now slipping me flash drives, forwarding me emails, handing over screenshots of Corinne's demands and threats. Each piece another stone in the wall we were building against her, and soon that wall became a fortress, one strong enough to finally launch our attack, but we still needed the right stage, a place where Corinne couldn't twist the narrative, where the evidence couldn't be buried, and fate, as if it too had grown tired of her tyranny, handed it to us in the form of the county's annual oversight hearing. A forum where HOAs were required to present their financial health to a small committee of officials, a boring event Karen usually waltzed through with her polished lies. But this time, thanks to the mountain of evidence we had assembled, it would become her battlefield, and she wouldn't even see the ambush coming. But Karen, cunning as she was, sensed something. Because in the days leading up to the hearing, she prowled the neighborhood like a restless queen, her SUV crawling down our streets at odd hours, her eyes darting from house to house. And one night I found a letter slipped under my door. No name, just a single line scrawled in sharp ink. She knows. And my blood ran cold, because if Karen suspected I was behind the growing resistance, she would unleash hell on me. And sure enough, the next morning I received 3 violation notices in my mailbox. Absurd claims about weeds in my yard, and improper paint shades on my shutters. Fines totaling nearly $1,000, more than I could afford, and I knew then she was onto me, that this was her warning shot. But instead of cowering, it only steeled my resolve. Because tyrants always overplay their hand, always mistake intimidation for control. And Karen had just revealed how desperate she was to protect something. Something bigger than fines or fees. Something buried in those numbers I had been tracing late at night. Because the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Corinne's greed wasn't just greed, it was survival. That beneath the pearls and smug smiles was a woman drowning in her own debts, funneling our money into accounts that fed not her ego but her creditors. Her vices, her secrets, and though I didn't yet know the full truth, I could smell it, foul and unmistakable, and I promised myself, as I folded that letter into my pocket and stared out at the dark, silent houses of my neighbors, that when we walked into that county hearing, we would drag every skeleton from Corinne's closet into the light. No matter how deep she had buried them, because we weren't just fighting for lower fees anymore. We were fighting for survival, and Karen, in her blind arrogance, had no idea how ready we were to burn her empire to the ground. And when the morning of the county oversight hearing finally arrived, the air itself felt heavy, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Because though most of the homeowners would never admit it out loud, they knew today could be the day Karen's empire cracked and I had spent the night before pacing my kitchen. My counter littered with manila folders, USB drives, and hand-scribbled notes. Evidence piled so high it looked like the frantic study of a madman, but it wasn't madness. It was preparation. The kind of preparation you make when you know your enemy has every advantage and you still intend to walk into battle with nothing but the truth in your hands. And as I stuffed the folders into a battered leather satchel, my phone buzzed. A simple message from Margaret. "We're with you." And those 3 words carried more weight than any speech could, because they reminded me that this wasn't just my fight, it was all of ours. Every homeowner who had been fined for trivial nonsense. Every family humiliated by Corinne's staged inspections. Every elderly resident who had been squeezed until their retirement funds bled dry. And though Corinne strutted around as if the HOA were her personal fiefdom, she had forgotten this simplest rule of power, that it only lasts as long as people consent to it. And today we were revoking our consent in the most public way possible. Corinne arrived at the county, building like a queen on parade. Her pearl necklace gleaming, her red blazer pressed crisp enough to cut, her entourage of sycophants trailing behind her like obedient courtiers. And she walked with that smirk that made your skin crawl, the one that said she already knew the outcome before it happened. And when she saw me across the marble lobby, her eyes locked onto mine. And for a moment, it felt like a duel had begun right there. 2 predators circling each other, except she didn't realize I wasn't hunting alone anymore, that I had a pack at my back, silent but united. And as we filed into the chamber, the walls lined with bored county officials, flipping through papers, I sat down, my satchel heavy at my feet, and reminded myself of the plan. Wait for Corinne to spin her lies. Wait for her to present her polished report, and then, when the timing was perfect, drop the truth like a thunderclap. The hearing began with the usual drudgery budget summaries. Maintenance reports, all delivered in Corinne's smooth, rehearsed tone, her voice dripping with false competence, and the officials, used to years of her performance, nodded along, eyes glazed, until she reached the section on community investments. And my chest tightened, because I knew that was where her trail of fraud began. And sure enough, she breezed through vague numbers, citing landscaping contracts and legal retainers that didn't add up. Numbers that I had traced to accounts in her maiden name, transfers to companies that didn't exist, and as she clicked to the final slide, a smug little chart showing a surplus. I stood, the scrape of my chair echoing through the chamber, and for the first time Corinne faltered, her polished smile freezing as I said, "Excuse me, but I need to present additional evidence for the committee's consideration." The room shifted instantly, the county chair frowning, the homeowners in attendance leaning forward, Karen's jaw tightening as she snapped. "This is highly irregular," but the chair held up a hand and said, "We'll allow it. Go ahead." And that was it, the opening we had prayed for, and with trembling hands I lifted the first folder from my satchel and began to lay it out. Page by page, printouts of bank transfers, emails bearing Corinne's signature, copies of checks written to show corporations, and the more I spoke, the quieter the room became, until the only sound was my voice and the shuffle of paper. And I will never forget the way Corinne's face transformed in those minutes. From icy confidence to simmering rage to a kind of desperate calculation, as if she were already running. through escape routes in her mind. And when I finally dropped the last piece of evidence, a ledger showing nearly $300,000 siphoned from HOA funds into her personal credit accounts, there was a collective gasp, one that seemed to rattle the very walls, and Karen, cornered at last, lashed out, her voice rising as she sneered, "This is slander, fabricated nonsense from a disgruntled resident who has been fined repeatedly for failing to follow community rules." But the officials didn't look convinced anymore. And worse for her, the homeowners in the back erupted in murmurs, some even shouting, "We knew it, and she's been robbing us blind." And the tide had turned so sharply it nearly drowned her right there. But Karen wasn't finished, because tyrants never go down quietly, and as the officials began to whisper among themselves, she slammed her palm on the table and hissed, "You think you've outsmarted me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." And for the first time, there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not smugness, not control, but fear, raw and sharp. And it told me there was more, something bigger than even the fraud we had uncovered. And I realized then that Karen's empire wasn't just built on HO dues and intimidation. It was connected to something darker, something outside our neighborhood. And though we had cracked the shell, I suddenly knew the yolk inside was poisonous. Because the way she glanced at the door, the way her hand trembled near her phone, it was the look of someone who wasn't worried about us anymore, but about forces far larger than this chamber. And my gut twisted as the chair announced they would be launching a full investigation, freezing all HOA accounts effective immediately. A decision that should have felt like victory. But instead it felt like we had just kicked a hornet's nest, one we weren't ready for, that night. As I walked back through the neighborhood under the watchful eyes of shuttered windows, I felt both triumph and dread gnawing at me, because though Karen had been publicly exposed, she was not finished, not by a long shot, and predators cornered in their own den don't surrender, they bite. And as I slipped inside my house, exhausted, I found another letter waiting on my kitchen. Counter, placed there despite my locked doors, a single sheet with 2 words scrawled in red ink. Too late.
The night the truth about Karen finally clawed its way into the open was not a quiet unraveling, but an explosion that lit the neighborhood like a lightning storm that refused to fade, and the same families who had once cowered beneath her endless fee increases and passive-aggressive HOA newsletters now stood shoulder to shoulder with clenched fists and tear-streaked faces, fueled not only by anger, but by the memories of empty refrigerators, unpaid medical bills, foreclosure notices pinned like death warrants to their front doors, all because of the merciless campaign Karen had waged under the false banner of community improvement. A campaign that had bled them dry while she grew fatter, smugger, and somehow richer with every meeting she presided over, gavel in hand like a queen ruling over serfs. And yet none of them had ever imagined the scale of her betrayal. Until the investigation pried it all open, first with whispers, then with documents slipped beneath doors in unmarked envelopes, and finally with the shocking revelation that the woman who claimed she had raised fees to save the neighborhood from bankruptcy had in fact been funneling their money into a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and personal luxuries. So extravagant they made the suffering she inflicted feel like a crime against humanity. And as the townsfolk gathered in the community center, ironically the very building Karen had once threatened to shut down unless they paid a maintenance surcharge, the air inside was suffocating with rage, but also with relief because, after years of silent endurance, the truth had given them permission to rise, to speak, to demand justice. And when Karen finally appeared at the doorway, her designer heels clicking defiantly against the tile, her face painted with the same smirk that had once silenced them, she found herself staring into an ocean of eyes that no longer feared her. Eyes that had seen bank statements proving she had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eyes that had watched video footage of her unloading shopping bags from boutiques while children down the street went hungry. Eyes that knew the truth about her husband's consulting firm that was nothing more than a funnel for HOA funds. And though she tried to raise her hand, tried to call the meeting to order as she always had, her voice cracked. Because the gavel she once wielded like a weapon had been stripped from her, placed on the table beside evidence files thick enough to choke her excuses, and the crowd surged forward, not with violence, but with a collective roar of testimony. Each neighbor recounting the nights they sat in darkness because electricity had been cut after she doubled their dues, the mornings they sent children to school with empty stomachs because food money had been poured into her reserve fund, the weekends they worked extra shifts just to keep up with fines for things as trivial as a dandelion on a lawn or a slightly faded mailbox. And as their words battered her armor of arrogance, cracks appeared, and for the first time Karen's smirk faltered, her lips trembling as she stammered about misunderstandings and unforeseen costs. But the avalanche had already begun, because the district attorney, once skeptical of their claims, had been handed irrefutable proof, and now uniformed officers stepped into the hall, their badges glinting beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. And the gasp that rippled through the crowd was not of fear, but of vindication. The sound of chains snapping after years of captivity, and even as Karen shrieked that she had done it, all for them, that she had kept the neighborhood safe, no one believed her anymore. Not after seeing the photographs of her private lake house purchased in cash with HOA funds. Not after learning of the vacations disguised as board retreats. Not after the ledger revealed she had spent more on imported wine in a single quarter than the community budgeted for playground repairs in a decade, and the officers clasped her wrists with cold metal cuffs, leading her stumbling through the gauntlet of neighbors whose silence was more damning than any jeer. And yet the story did not end with her arrest, because the damage she left behind was a battlefield. Families who had lost homes would never get them back. College savings accounts were gone. Elderly residents had died without heating in winters when she had raised emergency assessments to line her purse. And the people left standing had to decide whether they would let the HOA die with her or rebuild it into something different, something fair, and so the weeks that followed were both painful and miraculous, as survivors of her reign sat together for the first time without fear, drafting new bylaws that banned unchecked power. Electing leaders who had once been too poor to even pay the inflated dues, forgiving debts where they could, pooling what little resources they had left into relief funds for the hardest-hit families. And though the scars remained, so too did a fierce pride that they had survived, that they had torn down the mask of a tyrant disguised as a neighbor, and as Karen's trial began, televised for the nation to see, a grim spectacle of greed exposed. The community found healing in unity, and whispers of their story spread far beyond their streets, carried into other neighborhoods where HOA Karens reigned, inspiring rebellions that toppled petty empires, proving that no tyrant, no matter how cunning or cruel, could withstand the truth forever. And so, when spring finally came, and children once again played in the park without fear of a fee for laughter too loud, and families planted gardens without worrying about citations for unapproved flora, the people lifted their heads beneath the sun, scarred but unbroken, knowing that they had stared into the face of starvation and despair. And they had won, not just against Karen, but against the belief that they were powerless. And though the stain of her crimes could never be fully erased, the echo of their uprising became a shield, a promise whispered from neighbor to neighbor, never again, never again, never again.